Hi everybody, I'm David Alzamendi, and today we're going to be looking at the Medallion Architecture, the concept, the basics, as well as recommendations on how to implement this architecture within Microsoft Fabric. So let's get started. As you know, during the past few years, a new architecture or logical format for storing our data within the data warehousing technology and frameworks has been noticed, which is the Medallion Architecture. Let's go and get started. I'm sure you've heard about it, bronze, silver, gold, in some cases platinum. So let's see what it means for the organizations, and let's see what it means for you who you're trying to store the information within Microsoft Fabric. Let's get started. So within Microsoft Fabric, remember that we have many different options for storing the data. So we have to think of the basics as well. Over here. All right. So Microsoft Fabric, remember, is a set of tools. So you get a lot of tools. You don't have to use them all. You only have to use the ones that they fit within your use cases and what you're trying to build. But today we're going to be talking about how to use the Medallion Architecture for storing that information in one lake. So we'll be focusing on the one lake layer, and we'll be talking about the different data stores like the data warehouse, the lakehouse, the SQL databases, and so on. Whatever you're building in Microsoft Fabric, you have to remember that everything is possible. From building a lakehouse, a warehouse, a two-tier modern data warehouse, preparing a data science platform, you still have to have some data, right? Real-time analytics, and of course, it's not here, but now you also have the SQL databases available within Microsoft Fabric. So this is certainly a lot of opportunities for us to decide what we want to do within Microsoft Fabric. I would expect most of you, when you're adopting Microsoft Fabric, to start with a small set of use cases and go and try to execute on those ones, and then expand the platform with different technology. In a nutshell, in summary, so you might start doing some data warehousing and then move towards enabling some of those data science and real-time capabilities. Or you might decide just to start from a real-time analytics point of view. Everything is fine, but my suggestion is don't try to accomplish or to leverage all the different technologies within Microsoft Fabric from the get-go. So let's go and see what you see in common here in this specific slide. What's in common is that you have to store the data. You have to bring the data within Microsoft Fabric. When you look at Microsoft Fabric, remember, so the first step when you bring the data, to bring that information within one lake, is essentially finding the right data stores for storing your data. And you can see here on the left side, so we have some data sources that we'll have to bring within our source system. And this is really important to take into account because not all the data sources are the same type, as you know. So you will have some databases, some information coming from a SQL Server database or from an Oracle database or from any other relational database management system. You will also have information that you have to upload from different files, CSV files, Excel files, sitting in a shared drive, sitting in SharePoint, FTP drive, so many different alternatives. One that is becoming quite common in our data analytics platforms is that now we have to bring a lot of information from different vendors who offer different REST APIs. So I think we're in an era that we're moving from extracting most of our information from databases to an era where we're going to be extracting a lot of that data from different software providers that are offering REST APIs. What's unlucky for us, and you know this, none of those software providers that are giving us the APIs build those endpoints the same way. So, okay, let's move on. And then, of course, you have some sensor IoT, potentially real-time analytics data that have to be loaded. This will be important for us to define the correct data store within our Microsoft Fabric architecture. But once that you move that information within Microsoft Fabric, the Medallion architecture is basically moving the information through the bronze, the silver, and the gold layers while improving the data quality, enriching that data quality, applying business rules, creating KPIs, and so on. And then, of course, you'll be consuming that information from Power BI, paginated reports, or through the SQL analytics endpoint and making that information available to some of your applications. So let's go and drill down on actually what having a bronze, the silver, and the gold layer means. But remember, so one thing that is really important is that you might not end up using the 3 different layers depending on your business case. I'm going to cover that today. I think it's important that you get to choose what's the best for your organization. Before we move on, remember, so when you're moving that information across different layers, so you can take advantage of the notebooks, the Spark jobs, the pipelines, and the data flows, and potentially the store procs as well. Let's go and have a quick look at the Medallion architecture. So what the Medallion architecture means, and it's really simple, okay? From a logical point of view, it's a specific way of storing your information. So you can think about this in many cases of a logical way of storing the information. It doesn't have to be necessarily physically stored in different places for you to achieve this Medallion architecture. Besides, that we could argue that each layer might be stored in might be taking advantage of a different data store. Think about this, a logical approach for storing your information. So once that you move the information out from your source systems, the idea is that you'll put that information in the bronze layer. The bronze layer is basically the raw data as it was in the source systems for most cases. Isn't that right? Because when you're bringing information from APIs, you might decide to make some transformations before you put that information in the raw layer. Otherwise, what will you put in any case, right? If you're extracting JSON values from an endpoint, you have to somehow regenerate that JSON file and store it in the bronze layer. So you might take advantage of this step here and store the information a slightly different way. But in most cases will be the information as it was in the source system. Doesn't mean that you are able to apply some minor transformations if the source system requires you to have some sort of a ETL approach to bring that data in. Once that you move the information in the civil layer, so we're starting to apply some of data cleansing rules, validation, data quality, applying some of those business rules as well, creating some of those KPIs. We'll talk about this, if you are going to create dimensions and fact tables. So this will be a good layer for you to do it. The funny thing is there is no clear distinction. I think most of us will have to agree that dimensions and fact tables, they have to be created in the silver layer. But in some cases, depending on which white papers you're reading, they might say that the dimensions and fact tables, they have to be in the gold layer. Agree, disagree, right? So the outcome, independently on where you have the dimensions and fact tables, is quite similar. the information it has to be validated. You have to apply business rules. You have to do some data enrichment and so on. If you have as well a data vault model, so the silver layer will be the place where you put that data vault data model, essentially. And then the gold layer is basically one more layer where we can perform aggregations, enrich that information a little bit further, silo that information by different business domains, and more important, making that information available to the business so they can make informed decisions. At a high level, really easy to read it left to right. So you can go bronze, silver, and the gold layers. You know, bronze is raw data, silver is potentially enriching that data, creating your dimensions, fact tables, having your data vault data model in there, and the gold layer will be basically potentially silo that information by different business domains, creating aggregations. So if you have a table with, I don't know, let's go crazy, like a 50 trillion rows. So maybe you want to summarize that information before making it accessible to the business, because nobody is going to go through the most granular level of information of those rows to make an informed decision. So now let's go and look actually in real life what could happen. Okay, this in paper is really easy to follow. You have different layers, but what happens in real life, and especially when you want to go and develop this in Microsoft Fabric. Let's have a quick look. So to start with, when you look at the bronze layer, and we're thinking about implementing this in Microsoft Fabric, we have to take into account the data types that we're going to be working with, because many organizations that I've seen, they are just fine by importing the information from SQL Server databases or any other relational database management system, which essentially means that maybe you don't have to bring information from APIs, and that is going to open a lot of options for us. So let's look at the first case, the most common one. Let's start from the most common use case. And that case will essentially be, I'm on it, to have in the bronze layer a nice, finding the icon, just give me a sec. I have all the icons of all the data stores and I'm trying to find it. So this will be the most common case, having the lakehouse for the bronze layer. Why? Why having the lakehouse? Because the lakehouse allows you to have non-structured information. So as soon as you put any sort of files, the lakehouse is going to allow you to do that. So that means that when you bring the information from databases, from any of these different data types, even if you are using real-time analytics, so the lakehouse will be able to accomplish that specific use case. So let me just copy those names because we're going to expand on this one. So the lakehouse allows you essentially to put all those data types in there. So this is the lakehouse, the nice name, so we remember it. The lakehouse allows us to have that. So this could be the data store that you use as part of your Medallion architecture in Microsoft Fabric. You might decide to have the lakehouse. And this is the most common approach that I've seen, that I have implemented within Microsoft Fabric. Now, what happens? You might decide actually that you are mainly working with databases, and you might be working, let's say, with files. And it could be with APIs as well. So you might decide in that case that the best for you, based on your team and what you're trying to achieve, is that for the bronze layer, is that you use a warehouse. Now, let's go and see some of the differences that I see here. A problem that we have with the warehouse is that every time that you bring data in from a source system into the warehouse, I don't know why, and I don't like it, but you have to go and define a staging storage account here. In most cases. And you will see this. This is one more step in your pipelines. If you are using pipelines mainly, that you have to go and configure the staging storage account. This is so it gets, it prepares the information to take advantage of the existing technology for loading the information in the warehouse. I don't know why it is, but in many cases you have to go and define this staging area. You do that as part of the copy activities. Hopefully in the future that disappears, because that's one more point of failure. Within the files, the reason why I include in the files is because in the warehouse you cannot really have the file as such. So, but you can essentially apply the traditional extract, transform, and load process and extract that information, those files, and load that information straight into tables. But by doing that, we are going a little bit against the concept of having the raw data as it was in the source system. Still, while you have transformed the data from files to tables by doing an ETL process, the information looks as it was in the source system. So agree or disagree, right? So do you have to keep the same data type as it was in the source system for the bronze layer? I don't believe so. Look, as far as you keep the same data, the information looks the same as it was in the source system, I think that's good enough. Because that's the same scenario that we have for the APIs, correct? So if you are extracting information from APIs, so this means that you are getting information from REST API endpoints, and you are moving that information into potentially JSON files. But for you, JSON files, or it could be straight to tables as well, or tables. For doing this, you also have to follow the ETL process. You have to here follow an ETL or extract and load process. Most of you, it has to be ETL. Why? Because you have to loop through the different APIs that they've been paginated, and you're getting that response in different pages of the endpoints, and you have to potentially, ideally, put all those pages within the same data frame, and then load that information finally into your bronze layer. So there you see how this becomes a little bit more complex than what we thought before. And I'm going to give you one more option when looking at this. So, and the other option, and this one is sometimes overlooked because it might sound like it is new, but let's go and look at the having in here. Essentially, I'm on it, finding the right icon for us. You might define and say, you know what, we need to have an Azure SQL database, which is, it is another offering, right, that we have within Microsoft Fabric. And the technology here, the way that you present the information, it'll be quite similar to the warehouse, right? So you will have potentially importing the information from databases and from files, APIs. At the end of the day, when you start looking at this, you can potentially, by doing a little bit of ETL, or if you want to call it just EL, extract and load, you can potentially start loading that information either in the lakehouses, in the warehouses, or in the SQL databases in Microsoft Fabric. The main concept that you have to remember, so we want to keep this information as it was in the raw system. I think that's the main outcome. And there is one more scenario that I'd like to share with you. When moving the information into the raw area, let's create a small space for me to work here at the bottom. So let's share field. So the main idea when loading the information in here is that most of us, we're going to have some sort of, how can I call it? Let's say like, ideally you will have a staging area. So let me write it down here. Once that you land the information, you will have a staging area. Many of us will call actually this raw area the staging area in a traditional data warehousing. And within this staging area, because we want to, I'm going to give you two options. What happens usually? You might have like a transient staging area. Most of us with 100% will have this one in data warehousing. This means when you move the information into the transient staging area, then you load it in the civil layer, and tomorrow you override the information within the transient staging area. But one approach that I highly recommend is to actually have the transient staging area, and we're still in the bronze layer. We haven't gone anywhere further than the bronze layer. So have the transient staging layer, and then on top of that have a persistent staging area. This is still the information looks as in the source system, but this is going to give you a lot of flexibility from a data modeling point of view. So this means that tomorrow, when you bring the information from the source system, you will put it in the transient staging area. So this is the area that is going to be override every day. And then you are going to move that into the persistent staging area, which is a full copy of the data that you had in the source system. Depending on your use cases, especially if you are working in a medium or large size of organization with a lot of data assets, highly suggest exploring the persistent staging area concept. And let me see if we're missing something here in the bronze layer. But I think this is essentially it. So, and you can see again, to summarize, how you can use any of the data stores within the bronze layer. The most common one is still the Lakehouse, while you still have the alternative to use the warehouse or the SQL database if you want to. Now let's go to the silver. Let's go to the silver layer now. So remember, bronze layer, we have all the information as it was in the source system, but now we want to start making that information a little bit more accessible for reporting. So this is the common place where you're going to create your dimensions and your fact tables. Or if you're using Data Vault, this will be the place. So dimensions and fact tables, they will come in here. Any sort of logic that you like to do in here, this is about combining information from different source systems into the entities that we need for our organization, the data entities that we need and we're going to use for reporting. And you can classify them into dimensions of fact tables if you are using the traditional like a Kimball methodology. If you are using Data Vault, you will have here the Data Vault objects, and then of course you end up as well creating your, you will end up creating as well some sort of a star schema for reporting. But dimensions and fact tables go here. Here we could argue as well, we could start thinking about the same, that our architecture, you might decide to take advantage of the lakehouses. And hopefully this time doesn't take me as long to find the right items. But let's go and bring the lakehouse within our architecture. We have the lakehouse. Within the lakehouse, remember that in the latest version of the lakehouses, and this I didn't mention this as well, but when you're storing the information in the raw area, you really want to make sure that you isolate the information by the data source system. What essentially means is that in the case of the lakehouse, remember that you have schemas. And I highly recommend, in the case of the dimensions and fact tables, maybe having all those dimensions and fact tables under the same schema is not so much of an important decision. Maybe, having everything under like a specific schema is fine. Keep it simple, but definitely in the raw area. And I forgot to mention that in the bronze layer, remember in the lakehouses, or if you're using the warehouses or the SQL databases, have different schemas per data source system. So that means that if you are bringing the information from Salesforce, your schema within the bronze layer might be Salesforce, and you have all the information for Salesforce within that specific schema. Within the dimensions and fact tables, so you could have a lakehouse, so there's nothing wrong, but what you have to remember now is that because we're bringing the information from the bronze layer, and just let me copy this so it is clear here that we're bringing the information from the bronze layer. You have to perform some transformations, and this is what is going to drive a little bit what specific data store you are going to use. So if you are using a Spark, so ideally you want to land that information within your lakehouses, but it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily use a Spark as such, right? What's the benefit? Let's talk about this. Let me bring just the warehouse. And remember, the warehouses, you also have schemas, and same applies for raw area. So why would you choose to use the silver layer for lakehouses or warehouses? I think this is an important design decision within your organization. While I have recommended to stick to potentially use lakehouses for the bronze layer, in the silver layer, you have to choose between lakehouses and warehouses. Remember, so it comes down a little bit, not so much to the set of skills of your team, because any data engineer who knows Transact SQL is going to be more than capable to learn how to use Python and Scala and all those languages available within the notebooks. But it is also a preference on how to have that information available for the final users, and how to think of this strategically going forward. So if you are using let's go and look at the differences. If you're using lakehouses, your transformation is going to happen ideally with notebooks, or potentially you could argue that you can use Dataflows Gen 2. I don't like Dataflows Gen 2. I don't recommend them until they improve the performance and the number of capacity units that they use. So I'm not going to put them. If you're doing transformations within the warehouses, it'll be Transact SQL. We could argue as well the skills are specifically, they are different. So here you have to know a little bit, especially Python, Spark SQL, 100%. You can do everything with Spark SQL, any merge statement. And within the skills in here, we can put Transact SQL. If you've been using SQL Server, that's what it is. What happened with the information behind the scenes? So the information behind the scenes is just one lake for the two of them, right? and that takes advantage of the Delta Lake file formats. So that's the same for the two of them. There are a few differences in regards to isolation, data consistency that you might want to look at that. So one important thing within the Delta Lake format in the Lakehouse, remember, is partitioning. So this is really important, especially when you're trying to write into a table from multiple different notebooks or pipelines. And within the warehouses, currently we are limited in regards to partitioning. So if you try to go and create a table within a warehouse, you don't get the same capabilities in regards to partitioning. And that's super annoying, because I've been in scenarios where I had to write into a warehouse and I'm getting consistency errors because there is no an easy way of partition that information across multiple files within our Delta Lake file format. Something to take into account. But even when you look at this, right, you start looking at this, and even for me, it's difficult to choose or suggest what the right data store will be for your organization. And the reason for that is that essentially it comes down to your business needs and what you're trying to achieve. In some scenarios, I will say that within the silver layer, if you want to keep things simpler, you stick to only one data store type. So if you're using Lakehouse within the bronze layer, maybe try to stick to Lakehouses within the silver layer. There is a difference that I'm going to mention now, but remember, try to keep things simpler for you to maintain going forward. And if you choose to use the warehouses, that's fine, but at least make an informed decision. And now let's make this a little bit more complex than it is. So within the silver layer, when you're using the Lakehouses, you get a SQL Analytics endpoint. So let's see if I find a nice icon that we can put in here. Or if not, we're going to replicate this icon from here. So every time that you deploy a Lakehouse, it comes with a SQL Analytics endpoint. Let's put it here. So this is like a SQL Server connection string. Really handy. SQL endpoint. What's the limitation with this? So every time that you deploy this Lakehouse, it comes with a SQL endpoint as well as with a data set. It comes with a data set here that is using the new, let's move the items. I want to need some more room, I think. So every time that you deploy a Lakehouse, it comes as well with a SQL endpoint, and it comes with a nice data set here that is using Direct Lake, which is the new storage method within Power BI. So the difference with this SQL endpoint, which it looks essentially, is basically, it looks like when you access it, it looks like a SQL Server database. You see tables and you see you can create views and make that information available within reporting. The main thing that we are going to look at here is limitations. So when you set up this SQL endpoint, when you look at the SQL endpoint part of the Lakehouse, this SQL endpoint, you can only do read operations of the data, and there are some objects that you can create. So you can create any object like a view, you can create a store procs, but everything has to be essentially read operations. So you cannot update and you cannot delete the information. So this comes with SQL endpoints, and this data set here, it is essentially getting the information straight from the one lake and so on. But Another limitation that I like to mention here, and we're going to put it, let's see, let's remove this row. So let's make clear that this is limited to read operations. And one thing that I've seen with the dataset is that the datasets, when using Direct Lake, does not work with views currently. A few things that you have to consider. And now you're starting to see that it seems at a high level that you get way more benefits and opportunities with the lakehouses than within the warehouses. What if you were using a SQL database? You could be using a SQL database as a traditional data warehousing approach. I'm going to put it here at the bottom. There's nothing wrong with it. It works. So if you've been building data warehouses for the past 25 years, SQL Server is a proven technology. So whatever you build in an Azure SQL DB, you'll make it work. If you are working with terabytes and terabytes of data, that's maybe when you're going to run into some of the limitations of the SQL databases within Microsoft Fabric. But here are some differences for the silver layer. So you can stick to lakehouses or go and leverage warehouses if you prefer to use store procs to transform the data and so on. Remember, you also have you can take advantage of shortcuts if you don't want to move the information around. And when you deploy the lakehouse, that comes as well with a SQL endpoint and the dataset using Direct Lake, which is really, really cool. But you have to plan for it because the Direct Lake storage method has a specific recommendations that they have to be taken into account. Let's look at this for a second. I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything. And now we'll move to the next item, the gold layer. And there is a platinum layer that we're not going to cover today. I think it is overkill, trying to come up with new concepts. The platinum layer, and look, we've been building data warehouses for so long that sometimes we overkill the topic. Remember, so let's keep it simple: bronze, silver, and the gold layer for today. So the gold layer. So this is about aggregation. So a good example definitely is if you have a lot of information, you might want to summarize that information and make that information accessible for reporting, right? So if you have trillions of rows, you might have to summarize that information before you build a paginated report, in other words. But what happens here? So, do you have to move the data? Do you have to make transformations? My answer is going to be in most cases no, because you've seen it before. If you are using lakehouses, that comes with a few items that you can take advantage of. So remember, so if you create a lakehouse, that comes with a SQL endpoint, and that comes with the datasets. And remember that in the previous layer, so when we created the silver layer, we also, in the silver layer, we created the dimensions and fact tables. So remember, the information here comes from silver. So let me write it down. Put silver here on the left. And we're going to put as well the arrow. So the information here comes to silver. So that means that here in the silver layer, you already had some dimensions and fact tables. And in many cases, just by using the SQL endpoint from the lakehouse. So remember, this lakehouse is the one from the silver layer. I'm going to move it here to the left. This comes from there. So in many cases, you have created dimensions and fact tables, and that lakehouse comes with a SQL endpoint and Direct Lake. a data set for a direct lake. My recommendation here is, first of all, you don't really have to move any data. You can leverage the data assets that we had in the silver layer. So let's try to put it here. So all these objects that you see in here, so this comes from the silver layer. So let's move this. We make sure to put silver layer, and we move this to the top to make it a little bit more clear to us. So you have these objects in the silver layer. The warehouse is the SQL endpoint, the data set. So there is no any need for us to move the data. We can just leverage the information that we have in there. Even my recommendation for the gold layer would be to create some more shared semantic models that you can take advantage of for the gold layer in any hub. So all the information that you already created within your lakehouse or your warehouse, now you want to make it available. Let's change the icon into data sets that are using Direct Lake, but we're going to call this one shared data sets. And the idea of having the shared data set is that then you can have all the business rules or the KPIs will be in here in this, it'll be in this specific shared data set. So we're going to have the business KPIs. Let's make something bigger. So business KPIs, our calculations, you'll be able to modify the relationships between some of the, or fine tune the relationships between those dimensions and fact tables. You might end up creating multiple shared data sets depending on your business needs. Remember what I mentioned about domain models? You might have a shared data set that is for finance, and you might have another data set that is for HR. You might have another data set that is specifically for running operations within the organization. But the idea is to take advantage of the information that you had already in the silver layer to start exposing that information using different methods that you can define as part of the architecture of Power BI. This is just Power BI semantic models, right? You might have multiple shared data sets, or one data set, for line of business, or one data set per department. My recommendation, the end goal is to have all the information in one only data set. So in an ideal world, you will have all the information just in one data set, and then potentially use, row-level security filters, column object, column has the one for defining what columns to show to specific users or set of users. So in an ideal world, I highly suggest keep the number of semantic models as low as possible, because the more semantic models, the more shared data sets you have, the more you have to maintain. And some of those KPIs and business rules, while they belong potentially to a specific department, you might have to reuse them for other of your shared semantic models. And on top of that, remember, so real world. So the HR department might need some finance information. The finance department as well might need some of the operations information. So even though you might end up creating different shared data sets, the information needed for some of those line of business or departments will be the same. And that means duplicating the KPIs across the different shared data sets, and that becomes really difficult to maintain. So this is one option, having different shared data sets by business domain. The end goal is to have just one corporate corporate master. Let's put all the nice work here. Shared dataset that contains all the information as well using Direct Lake. Can you use import mode? Can you use direct query? Yes, yeah, go for it. The only reason why I put Direct Lake because I do believe that it's a game changer. Besides some of the limitations that you might find in the current offering of Direct Lake, but then this is the end goal, having this corporate master shared dataset with all the information. And here we take advantage of row level security filters to filter the information for specific users or departments, and I think it's a column level security or similar. I don't remember the name. If you remember the name, put it down in the chat, and so the people know the exact name. But this is about filtering different tables or exposing different tables and columns to different set of users. Now you've seen in the goal layer, the idea is not to move the data, but take advantage. We're talking within Microsoft Fabric, of course. Not to move the data, but take advantage of that, some of the information that we have in the Silver layer and the shared data sets and the SQL endpoints to make that information available to the business. Let's look at the aggregations. So if you wanted to do aggregations in the goal layer, let's say that you don't want to expose 3 trillions of rows within your shared dataset, Direct Lakes, you might use the SQL endpoint in here to create some SQL views that aggregate the data. And this could happen as well within the warehouse. So this will help you accomplish that information. Remember, within the SQL views right now, you cannot take advantage of a Direct Lake, but if you are doing some aggregations, you can do that at the SQL endpoint and the warehouse layer within the Silver layer objects. And now, finally, we've looked at the goal layer. Let's go and look at what could happen in real life. So when you look at this information, let's start by the data sources. We're saying that the data sources have to come through the bronze layer. In a real world scenario, you might have information actually coming straight to the Silver layer. So you might have some information that you load straight from your data sources into the Silver layer. Examples that I've seen of these scenarios, it could be actually reference data that you're bringing from a specific system. So you might have to bring some reference data, some master data. So those are the main examples. You might decide to load that information straight from the data source systems straight into a Silver layer. I don't see a reason why you should go to the bronze layer. We could agree and disagree. If you want to keep the same, data as it was in the source system. But so far, I haven't seen any value on doing that. You might want to put in the bronze layer because you want to create dimensions and fact tables out of reference and master data. But I've seen cases, real world scenarios, where you might import information straight from the source systems, especially reference and master data straight into the Silver layer. So this is a good example on why the data might not be loaded only in the bronze layer. And then, as you've seen before, let's go and look at this strategically from a reporting point of view. We're talking that we mentioned that the goal layer is for making the information available for reporting, but if you have operational data in your staging layer, so if here you have some operational data that you want to make available for operation reporting without having you to go through all the different layers. I've seen some reporting coming out from the bronze layer as well. So in some cases, you might decide to build some operational reporting out of the bronze layer, and that's nothing wrong. That potentially even means that you are jumping straight from the bronze layer into a gold layer by using a SQL endpoint. Put it that way. Another example, it could be that you might decide not to have the silver layer at all. So you might decide to have the lakehouse into your bronze layer, and essentially just take advantage of the that data set that is provisioned as part of the lakehouse. So we're going to put it here, and you might want to treat this as your Medallion architecture, correct? You might just decide to have this lakehouse, and this, let's put the name to it. So this will be the lakehouse, and this will be the data set that comes straight out of the lakehouse data set, the one that is provisioned as part of the SQL endpoint. So you might decide to have this sort of, once that you land the information in the bronze layer, so make that information available for reporting by using the lakehouse dataset, which will be quite similar, doing the example of operational reporting, but having that information a little bit more organized. You're looking at this example, and see, we haven't created any dimensions or fact tables. We went straight for essentially reporting in here. This is another example. Let's go and put the most traditional examples in here. So those ones will be having the lakehouse. Let's copy this one to make my life easier. So having the lakehouse here, let's put this together, and in the silver layer you will have another lakehouse as well, and then you will take advantage of the SQL endpoint that we previously created. Let's bring that SQL endpoint from silver, and we'll put it here in the gold layer. This is the most traditional pipeline that we've been implementing. This lakehouse to lakehouse, and then having the SQL endpoints, and the shared semantic models available for reporting. And finally, the last example is combining those data stores. Let's organize this a little bit. So this is a lakehouse. Another example that instead of you having a lakehouse, you have a warehouse in here. So let's make this a little bit bigger. I'm trying to draw so many architecture patterns here that I know it's not going to look pretty, but I want to show you that you have so many options. So you might go warehouse, lakehouse to warehouse. Let's write it down here. And again, taking advantage of those semantic models. So you might create new semantic models using Direct Lake and having that information available in the gold layer. And the other design pattern that we also talk about is just potentially having just a warehouse in the bronze layer, having a warehouse in the silver layer with your dimensions and fact tables, and making that information available for reporting by using the semantic models that you're going to create out of the data in the silver layer without you having to move the information. So in this case, this will be Direct Lake. The one at the top, this one is essentially a SQL endpoint. Let's put a name to it. So here are different design patterns. What about the workspaces? Look, currently, if you were looking at creating a lakehouse for bronze and a lakehouse for your silver layer, my suggestion will be having them in the same workspace. Ideally, I would like to have the different lakehouses for the different layers in different workspaces. So that's the end goal. The end goal is to have a lakehouse for the bronze layer in a specific workspace, and the lakehouse for the silver layer in a different workspace. Now, I ran into so many challenges when trying to do cross lakehouses queries across different workspaces that I've given up, and right now, because of some, let's say, developer experience, you might decide to have the lakehouses within the same workspace. That is going to make your life so much easier when moving the data between lakehouses using notebooks. But if you want to have lakehouses across different workspaces for the different Medallion architecture layers, it can be done by using the one lake endpoints and so on. But the developer experience is horrible. Okay, so maybe this is my final suggestion. Listen to me. So have the lakehouses for bronze and silver within the same workspace for the time being. That is going to enhance the developer experience when using notebooks. And then eventually, when Microsoft makes things a little bit easier, you can move the silver layer to a different workspace. So I don't, technically it's feasible. It's not difficult to do it. If you want to start straight out from the start line by having lakehouses in different workspaces, it can be done. You can use the one lake endpoints. A little bit painful from a developer's point of view, but once that you set up the framework, that's up and running. Yeah. So keep it simpler. Keep it simpler for you from a starting point of view. Many of our users are not going to be accessing the lakehouses and writing Python, Scala, and Spark SQL from the get-go. Most 99% of our users are going to be taking advantage of the information by using the semantic models and Power BI and that sort of experience. If I can recommend something as well, the gold layer. So the gold layer, when you start creating those shared semantic models, have that in a different workspace. Okay, have those shared semantic models in a different workspace. Don't use the out-of-the-box semantic model that is provisioned out of from your lakehouse or your warehouse. Create new semantic models and store those semantic models in a different workspace. So that will look like this. So you will have a workspace for your data stores. You will have a workspace for your semantic models that you're creating, and you will have a workspace for your reports. So not within the semantic models, in a different workspace, and another workspace for anything related to data integration and moving the data. I know it sounds like a lot. I'm talking about 4 different workspaces. We could have another workspace for machine learning and data science activities. And talking about 5, you can have more workspaces and more. See, it's not as easy. You could end up with a lot of workspaces, but I think it is the right thing to do. Think strategically about it, keep it simple. And I know we tried to cover so many design patterns today. All of them, they come with some advantages and disadvantages, with benefits that you have to write it down and look at the trade-offs if you want to stick to something simpler as well. If you are thinking about implementing the Medallion architecture, start by choosing lakehouses for the bronze and the silver layers. And then if that doesn't work for your organization, then you change it. But don't start from a blank canvas as well. we've done warehouses only implementations. We've done medallion architectures implementations with only lakehouses and also with the combination of lakehouses and warehouses. My suggestion, start from a specific architecture that you feel comfortable with, and if that doesn't show, it doesn't feel like it's fit for purpose, you can always change it. But don't start with blank canvas. That will take you, down a rabbit hole, and you will waste a lot of time for your team and for you as a data practitioner. I hope you learned a few things today about the Medallion architecture and how to implement it within Microsoft Fabric. Remember, this is just a logical way of storing the information within your data stores. How you do it, that's up to you, how you implement it. You've seen today 3 or 4 different options at the very minimum. And if you like this video, please subscribe, and hopefully we'll see each other next week as well. Stay tuned.